Hello, everyone. On behalf of the International Big History Association, I extend a warm welcome to today's webinar on the Anthropocene as a new phase of big history. We will explore how human activities have shaped our planet's geological, ecological, and atmospheric systems. And from the emergence of Homo sapiens to modernity, humanity has left an undeniable mark on Earth's history. But what does the Anthropocene mean within the grand narrative of big history? Join us as we delve into this pivotal chapter, considering its implications for our understanding of human civilizations and the future of our planet. Joining us today are the esteemed historian and IBHA founder, David Christian, an emeritus professor at Macquarie University in Australia, and the Anthropocene advocating geoscientist, Emlyn Koster, Director Emeritus of the Royal Tyrrell Museum in Canada. Together, Dr. Christian and Dr. Koster will provide us with insights and perspectives as we delve into the complexities of the Anthropocene epoch. So, without further ado, let's begin. Welcome, Dr. Christian and Dr. Koster, and thank you for joining us. Okay.
Thank you very much, Daniel.
Okay, it's very nice to see you here. I'll show you an art so that we can talk. Okay, we can start the conversation. Can you set the stage and introduce us to the age and development of life on planet Earth, including the evolution of human life? I think that's the background for our conversation, maybe.
Well, Daniel, thank you, and good evening, and hello, David. Pleasure to be with you both on this, I think, important conversation. I'll make some remarks about the information on this slide from left to right. The solar system is 4.5 billion years old. That sounds a very large number, but to maybe get our heads around 4.5 billion, let's remember that there are more than 8 billion humans on the planet. So there's almost, the number of years in Earth history is a bit over half the number of people that live on the planet. Maybe that doesn't help, maybe it helps. But what that first slice of this slide says is that, all of Earth history is really divided into eons in the first order. Geological history is like human history. We every day talk about seconds, minutes, weeks, months, years, decades, centuries, millennia. Well, geologists talk about, epochs and periods and eras and eons. It's just another way of dividing time, except that the magnitude of the time is vast in the case of geology. So the Phanerozoic is where we are now in the geological present. It's the last 550 or so million years. You see it as the top white slice in that left part of the slide. And then if we open that up into the middle column, we have this sort of schematic going from maybe a time when the only life on Earth was algae and bacteria, up to a depiction of a city or a town. And the Anthropocene is a tiny, tiny, tiny sliver at the top of that diagram. That's covering 550 million years. As we will discuss in this conversation, the Anthropocene has been given different definitions, ranging from as little as 70 years since the mid-20th century, up to 10, 12, 15,000 years back to the end of the Ice Age. But let's go to the right-hand side, which cranks the microscope down even closer. So in today's world, in today's planet Earth, when we talk about biodiversity, we also talk a lot about diversity in a human construct, but science has so far discovered over 2 million species, plant and animal species of all kinds. And of those 2+ million, only about 5,500 are mammal species. Well, humans are mammals, of course, and depending on the classification, as it says in the next bullet, between 376 and 524 of those mammals are primates, which is our group of mammals. And what's amazing, and what I think a lot of people don't understand, is that today we are the species and the genus Homo sapiens, But if we go back just, and I say just, some 40,000 years ago, we also were in the company of the last other remaining species of the genus Homo, which were Neanderthals. And so we'll talk about them some more, I think, in the next short while in this program. But, you know, we are living in a rare time of being the only species of our genus. And then if we take it one stage further, with so much discussion about diversity and race and ancestry, it's important to realize that just 1/10 of 1% of the DNA of Homo sapiens is actually a variation. Where, you know, although we make a big deal about the differences of our looks and our skin color and our languages and our cultures, in fact, there's only 0.1 of 1% that actually makes us different. And so race is really, although it's such a big deal term, it's only a social construct. It doesn't actually have a biological definition.
All right. And about the Anthropocene concept, it's, of course, it represents a very, very big deal for big history. And when it was first considered, and what it means after all.
Well, David will have views on this too. I know he's, you know, for a long time been a very esteemed student of you know, versions of looking at the Earth's history from a human lens and a pre-human lens. What I'll just say in my answer to your question is that I think for me, the history of that understanding picks up with this incredible explorer, this German explorer, Alexander von Humboldt, who, as you can see, lived from the mid-1700s to the mid-1800s. But I think in 1801, 1802, he made this incredible expedition across the Atlantic from Europe into Central and Northern South America. And this expedition, he was incredibly intuitive and very, very fantastic in his observations about everything he saw in the landscape and in life. And so if we skip forward to 2019, we have a very helpful paper published in the journal Science, the flagship journal of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, by Stephen Jackson, called Humboldt's Fusion of Science and Humanism, which is really cutting to the chase of what the Anthropocene is all about, the fusion of science and humanism. And so there's a quote there that as Jackson writes, speaking about Humboldt, he says, the Anthropocene discussion focuses attention on a fundamentally Humboldtian observation. Humanity and nature are deeply intertwined. Nature would persist in the absence of humanity, but humanity cannot exist without nature. But then, as we'll discover and talk more about, the whole history of the term Anthropocene starts off quite symbolically at the turn of this century, in the year 2000, and I'm sure we'll get to some of those details.
And David, of course, we can't, at least I can't think about big history without considering the idea of the Anthropocene. I used to think that maybe big history is how history should be studied in the Anthropocene. What do you think, David, about what the Anthropocene means for big history studies? What's your take on that?
Thank you very much. Thank you, Emlyn, for your sort of introductory remarks. And I'm really enjoying getting clarification about how geologists approach the idea of the Anthropocene. Could I make just one very general point, which is that I love the idea of the Anthropocene because it's an inherently big history concept. But one other thing it does, I think, is you mentioned, Emlyn, that von Humboldt helped us sort of see science and the study of humanity as linked. Well, I think it's maybe only in the modern era that we needed help in linking those concepts. I think the idea of human beings as embedded in the world has been just a natural insight, probably for most human societies until the modern era. until we began to sort of have so much knowledge that we had to partition it into disciplines and began to think of disciplines a bit like nations as completely separate. So now we're having to relearn how to embed our studies of humanity within the study of geology or the climate system or the planet or the cosmos. And that, I think, is one of the things that big history is trying to do, is re-establish a sense of the interconnectedness of the universe against the huge pressure exerted by modern scholarly disciplines to think of knowledge as separated into completely separate compartments. And now what the Anthropocene idea is showing us is that thinking like that too much, thinking in compartments, can be very helpful. It's a necessary discipline, but doing that too much can be dangerous. So, Daniel, I couldn't quite get your question because my hearing is pretty terrible. I hope I've responded roughly to what your question was saying.
Yes, you did. I would like to comment just one thing about one thing you said. Would you agree with me that maybe the concept of the Anthropocene and maybe even big history, they are something necessary for people living in society, in disenchanted societies, because I see no point in speaking about thinking of society and geology and nature, so to say, for people, for example, with I don't know, with traditional Native American background, for example. We were talking earlier about indigenous cosmologies, and don't you think that the idea of the Anthropocene and big history are necessary for people that are disenchanted, Weberian disenchanted?
Let me pick up on what David was saying in your question, Daniel, a little bit. For me, there is this. David is quite right in terms of the fusion of science and the humanities, which is not so much of a fusion these days. And I think they started to separate in the human intellect. There was, I think, a major moment in the 1950s when there was a lecture given at the University of Cambridge, which has been very, very well recalled, a lecture by an essayist called C.P. Snow. And he spoke about his concern that the human intellect had separated into two solitudes, he called it, two solitudes, the sciences and the humanities. But I think you're right to bring in that over the last, 70 years, we have become, we Western people, so-called, as opposed to indigenous native people, have become, overly, we have become guilty of these two solitudes. And David speaks about the multidisciplinarity of knowledge, which is so essential. But I think we do need more and more to learn that the nature and culture symbiosis of indigenous people, the first humans, does need to be appreciated more and more deeply the more that so-called Western societies become consumed with a separation of nature and culture.
Could I add one more point that I think
Yes.
I think we need to relearn the links, the extent to which humans, our species, is embedded in and part of the natural world and a very recent arrival in the natural world. But it also seems to me that there is something radically new in the idea of the Anthropocene. And that is an idea about the power of our species and the dangerous power of our species. I think probably all cultures have, there have been people within probably all cultures who've been inclined to exaggerate the power and importance and significance of humans. And, many of the institutionalized religions make it very clear that they see humans as as sort of dominant over other species. In the Christian Bible, you know, the humans were given domination over all other species. But what is radically new, I think, is the scientific insight into the fact that collectively we 8 billion humans are now transforming an entire planet, and that is something new. We've always had a significant impact on their environments, but now that impact is planetary, and that, I think, is the new insight of the Anthropocene. So we need to bring together the new insights which science has generated by measuring our impact on other species, on the climate systems, on the atmosphere, with the older, ancient insight that we are nevertheless deeply embedded in our surrounding. So bringing together the insights of modern science with the ancient understanding that we are embedded in the natural world, and that our survival depends on respect for our environment and our surroundings.
David, you bring, I think, forward very necessarily the fundamental attribute of what the Anthropocene means. I think anthro, human or sentient, and scene being an interval of time. We Homo sapiens have indeed radically disrupted the natural workings of the Earth system. But I think, you know, science has something to be blamed for here. As a geologist myself, let me just point out in the context of this part of our discussion that, you know, back in the late part of the last century, geology was still a pretty pure kind of science. You know, we were concerned with understanding the geography of oceans and continents, and we started to grasp plate tectonics and seafloor spreading, that continents are always moving, and as they move, they compress sedimentary piles on coastlines that get thrust up into mountains, and we started to understand the nature and reason and the difference of volcanoes, and then we started to understand the distribution and origins of fossil fuels and mineral resources. This was the pure, what I would call the pure side of geology. It was not until really the 80s and 90s when we started to develop not just an Earth-centric view, but really an Earth system view, that the solid Earth, what we sometimes call the geosphere, comprising the continents, oceans, and the core and the mantle of the planet, and its processes and how they change things over time, that all has to be seen in concert with the other enveloping shells of the Earth system, the atmosphere, the hydrosphere, the oceans and the rivers, the cryosphere, the frozen part of the hydrosphere in the form of ice sheets and glaciers and tundra, frozen ground in the northern latitudes of North America and Asia. And then we come down into the biosphere, which of course is interdependent with the atmosphere, with the hydrosphere, and with the surface of the Earth, which is the surface of the lithosphere. And so I think what the Anthropocene is also doing is, although we have so much focus on climate change and extreme weather, we need to, as a geologist, I feel strongly that we need to, and as an Anthropocene aficionado, may I say, I think we need to always try and open out the dialogue and realize that the impacts of humanity on the Earth system have been encompassing, and really no part of the Earth system and its subsystems of atmosphere, hydrosphere, cryosphere, lithosphere, and within that, as we may talk about some more, we could say that the human species has formed a humanosphere, but really that's very sort of very human-centered, because we're saying that out of the biosphere we need to have our own sense of self, and that, I think, is full of hubris, and we do that very, very cautiously. So I think we'll get into those aspects some more, Daniel, I'm sure.
Mm-hmm.
Could I add quickly one more idea, which I don't know what your reaction will be, Emlyn, but you remember the great Russian Soviet geologist Vernadsky, proposed the idea of the noosphere. Now, it's an idea that I was very suspicious of for a long time, but recently I went back to it and I was reading some of his comments on it, and I began to think that it's actually a very good idea. It's that there is a sphere of human thought, and it's not the thought of individuals. It's the vast body of ideas and information that humanity has generated over several 100,000 years, but very particularly in the last few hundred years. And that sphere of thought, much more intangible than the other spheres you've described, is beginning to have a colossal impact, because of course, thought does have an impact because it drives what people do. And suddenly our species, the thinking of our species, is beginning to shape these other spheres. And that sometimes seems to me a very helpful idea. And can I add one more point, which is about hubris? I see a lot of writing that is very nervous about exaggerating the significance of humans. I think that opposition to hubris can go too far, because the truth is we are astonishingly powerful, and I believe there is no single species in the history of planet Earth over 4 billion years since life first appeared that has ever had such an impact on the planet. So I think we can go too far in trying to avoid hubris. What the science is showing is that a kind of modest hubris, if that doesn't sound too paradoxical, is very, very appropriate at the moment. We need to understand how powerful we are if we're to use that power in sensible ways.
Agreed, David. I don't think I know the origin of the first part of the word noosphere. Where does nuo, N-O-O, come from?
Knowledge, the knowledge sphere.
Knowledge sphere.
Okay. The sphere of knowledge. I would add I think it's very close to the idea of the humanosphere is probably doing much of the same work as the idea of the noosphere, but the idea of a sphere of conscious, aware knowledge is some people have treated it as mystical. I don't think it's mystical at all. I think it's actually a quite precise concept, because anthropologists and cultural philosophers know perfectly well that the thoughts of humans can actually have a real physical impact on the world. So I think it's a helpful idea, and one that sort of got lost somewhere. James Lovelock, of course. I think we should mention James Lovelock, because he because of his friendship with the novelist William Golding, is it? He may have sort of teetered on the verge of sort of mystical concepts, but I think nevertheless the idea of Gaia drove a hell of a lot of thinking amongst scientists about how you integrate knowledge from different sciences about the system, the planetary system as a whole.
Yes, the noosphere also reminds me that, you know, when the pandemic began, the COVID-19 pandemic, there was suddenly talk about a virosphere. That part of the humanosphere or the noosphere, which is actually very important to humans, at least we thought so, and as we discovered when millions of us died because of a pandemic. And so the part of the biosphere within the humanosphere, but also the non-human part of the biosphere, is a dynamic environment in which viral diseases can spread and of course can transfer disease from non-humans to humans and amongst humans. And so, you know, we're very focused in the post-pandemic, post-COVID period. If we're post-COVID, I'm not sure yet, but that has stirred also a consciousness that we need to be always trying to be vigilant with new technologies to stop what nature wants to do on its own.
Well, in fact, what we've done is created new possibilities for the natural world. So the noosphere has created wonderful, it's provided first-class tickets for viruses all around the world. So they can travel around business class in 24 hours. And that is a creation of the noosphere. And of course, the viruses are doing their traditional thing, but they're doing it within a world transformed by us humans.
Well, when I next have the luxury of traveling first class on a plane, David, I'll try not to think about first class virusphere components next to me. Good analogy, though. Good metaphor. Back to you, Daniel.
Yeah, I'd like to make a provocation here before we skip to our next topic. I understand that there's a lot of conscious thinking and behavior related to the idea of noosphere, but would you agree with me that most of human action actually producing what we call the Anthropocene are actions driven by unconscious behavior? Because should we speak of a sphere of knowledge, or should we speak about a sphere of behavior?
I think that's you raise a very important facet, Daniel, and
Yeah.
I'm sure David will want to jump in here. Let me sort of answer it through the lens of indigenous people. Some of my writings about the Anthropocene have diverged over to the concepts of being a good ancestor and 7-generation thinking, which are very prominent in Iroquois and Dakota indigenous people in North America. And what 7 generations speaks to is that, and these are alive and well in Australian Aboriginal cultures and also in North American, Native American and Canadian cultures, which is that any one generation is very aware through oral history and through sort of the evolution of the conscience in those societies of what has gone on before and what will go on after. So 7-generation thinking encapsulates that here we are in our own current generation. We're preceded by our parents and our grandparents and our great-grandparents, and we will be succeeded by our children, our grandchildren, and our great-grandchildren. That's 7 generations. That encompasses, 150, 200 years, which is a tiny sliver of time, but at least it stretches it out. The notion of being good ancestors is, I think, a related and powerful concept, which is missing from the me now rather than the we future mentality of Western people. And I'm generalizing, but I think accurately so. The good ancestor approach says that it's very selfish and very self-centered to be focused on our own generation and not to think in a 7-generational way, and to realize that what we do, how we think, how we act, and our influences on the next generations should make us into good ancestors. I think indigenous people think very much along those lines, and Western people in general are very focused on, contrary things like materialism now. And I think that's been a source of our problem in many ways.
Actually, can I put a slightly different side to that, Emlyn? I think I've begun to use this this idea that the press presents an exceptionally bleak account of the way the world is at the moment. And the reason is very clear, is that our neurological systems are designed to react more strongly to bad news than to good news. So that if you want to sell newspapers, you'll give people a frisson by telling bad news. So the newspapers, the media, and particularly social media are full of news about people behaving badly. And of course, there's plenty of news like that. I'm not saying the news is wrong, but I think if you look, there may be there's growing evidence that there is emerging, I think, despite the media, a global consciousness of the need to be good ancestors. And I see all sorts of signs of it that often don't get reported adequately in the press. I think the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations, for example, you can be very cynical about them and you can say, yes, it's just rhetoric. But I believe every member nation of the United Nations has signed up to them. And if you look at the Sustainable Development Goals, as utopian as you may think they are, what they are is a plan for a good future, not just for humanity, but for the biosphere as a whole. And they are shared by every government in the world. And so I think we're not yet doing it enough. We're not yet serious enough about being good ancestors. But I actually see many positive signs that the ethos of being a good ancestor to future generations is actually emerging and becoming more powerful. And then I watch things like the very rapid development of new technologies to start coping with some of the challenges. We don't know if this will happen fast enough, but I'm a bit more optimistic than you are, Emlyn, about the emergence of a sort of thinking which is about being a good atmosphere. But I've got a feeling Daniel's question was about consciousness rather than conscience.
Yes, consciousness.
When it fits, I have to come back on what David just said, Daniel, but I'll let you guide our conversation. Go ahead.
Okay. Returning to this point, do you think the planet is going to have the time needed? What I mean, if the technological changes that can be made, will they happen fast enough to cope with the pace of the destruction? Because we have to consider that we are dealing with complex systems, and maybe something that's just made in order to correct some problem can create another, and
Well, I would say not fast enough. I'm going to be a pessimist on this one, Daniel. I think, let me go back to what David was saying. It is true that when the United Nations in 2015, all 180 or so nations were, in a very rare moment for the UN, unanimous in supporting the 17 Sustainable Development Goals in a plan called Transforming Our World. Last year, 2023, was the midpoint, 7 years after their promulgation, and 7 years before 2030, which was the so-called outer boundary of the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. And what the Secretary General said in the mid part of last year is that the plan is in peril, that we need a rescue plan. And in fact, most people can't cite a sustainable development goal. A lot of people have been cynical about the use of the word sustainability, which after all means maintaining supplies for future generations. Well, the word sustainable doesn't apply when we're causing other animals to become extinct, or when we're warming the atmosphere more than we can ever cool it, or when we're raising sea level and we have no means of lowering sea level from flooding coastal communities. So there's a lot of nice talk, I would say, if I'm to be sort of constructively critical, but I think the SDGs are under assault. And this coming September at the UN headquarters in New York, there is a summit of the future, which must start to look at different ways at bringing forward a more realistic world plan than just simply continuing the journey of the 17 SDGs with their 169 targets. It was nice, it was bold, It was appropriate. It was the best thing we had. There's no other body in the world that can plan as well as maybe the UN can. But on the other hand, it's also got its frailties and its limitations. And right now, the SDGs are widely talked about as being in deep trouble. And I think it's really only the young people who are very keen to demonstrate, and whether it's Fridays, the Friday movement or the Extinction movement, or individuals like Greta Thunberg of Sweden, who are prepared to go in front of world leaders and say, the problem is there's no leaders in the room, that you have wrecked our future generation. And she's a Swede, and the other famous Swede that became a Time magazine Citizen of the Year last year is Johan Rockström from Berlin. He's a Swede, and he, back in 2009, made known something which is very useful, which is that from a human perspective, the Earth system has 9 operating limits. And 2 years ago, it was made clear that we've already passed 6 of those 9 operating limits. So we're in deep problems. And I think, technology might be part of the answer, but attitudes, I think, have to be a bigger part of the answer.
Absolutely. But you were talking about thinking like an ancestor. My point was that I see lots of evidence of efforts to think like an ancestor. They may not be adequate. I agree with everything you say, but the efforts to think like an ancestor are not completely absent in the world. There's a lot of that thinking going on. And can I add one more thing, which is that what we haven't talked about really is the speed of change in the Anthropocene. It's like a whirlwind. So trying to figure out what needs to be done is fantastically difficult, and events are getting ahead of us. There's absolutely no guarantees that we'll get it right. But on the other hand, it's absolutely crucial that we don't allow pessimism to cripple us. We think of this as a huge, complex, fantastically complex challenge, and our job is to do as well as we can in meeting that challenge. And I see vast amounts of effort being devoted to meeting that challenge. And I think I think optimism, not a realistic optimism, is an absolutely crucial tool in facing the future. Because I meet people who are so pessimistic about the future that they've given up. They've completely given up. And that is just not helpful. So and one more, if I can make, which is that particularly as a big historian, you look at the longer trajectory of human history, the changes in the last 200 years, and particularly 100 years, are so staggering that expecting more change of that nature in the next 100 years, I think, is not being naively what's the term, in love with technology. I think the pace of change in the last 100 years means that expecting technological fixes to go along with changing attitudes is not unrealistic. Let's put it that way.
So let me just pause on a moment 55 years ago. Apollo to the moon. First time we landed on something else within the solar system, and it was technologically marvelous. And we probably, if we don't remember it because of our age, we certainly probably have heard that Buzz Aldrin, I think it was him, one of the astronauts, said, "This is a giant leap for humankind," right? Well, I'm not quite sure. I think that was very exuberant, very optimistic. I'm not sure what the giant leap was, because in fact, the very next year, we had millions upon millions of people gathering in cities around the world for the first Earth Day, objecting to the human damage on environments. We didn't think about climate so much then. It was pollution and the disappearance of other species in the biosphere. But today, we know that the human impact, as we were saying earlier in our conversation, has been encompassing, and that there's not a subsystem of the Earth system. The atmosphere, the hydrosphere, the cryosphere, the biosphere, and even into the surface of the solid Earth, when we try to bury and forget dangerous residues of nuclear fuels and so on, we've impacted every part of the Earth system, and many of the animals and plants that used to exist are no longer there, and they're not going to come back. That was not sustainable. And so I think that, as we go back to the moon in the Artemis mission, which is scheduled for 2 or so years from now, ostensibly that's to prove that we can land on the moon and make a station there to go deeper into space, maybe to Mars. I happen to think that that's not a very good idea, and that's not a very good use of resources. And if we're going to say something like, this is another giant leap for humankind, and we're only defining that as our ability, technologically speaking, to go deeper into space, and we don't deal with the problems that we have created here on planet Earth, I think that would be a grave mistake.
Do you think that what we are experiencing as a species, or as a species formed by so different societies, some of them rich, some of them poor, with all this technology and the power of destruction, do you think that the Anthropocene is an evidence that the Fermi's paradox might be right?
That what might be right?
The Fermi's paradox, the idea that there might be advanced civilizations out there, but they are nowhere.
Yeah. Can I have a go at that? And it's really continuing this discussion. You asked earlier about conscious decisions. Could I suggest, Daniel, a distinction between conscious decisions, which are decisions that are thought about, and planning? Because a hell of a lot of conscious decisions have consequences. I mean, you've already said this, Emlyn, have consequences that are unplanned. So I think to understand, we haven't really asked the question, why the Anthropocene? Why is this species, which we are members of, suddenly so terrifyingly powerful that it may be on the verge of destroying itself and much of the biosphere along with itself, and therefore, fitting into that paradox? Why is that true? And I've been arguing for many years, and I remain rightly or wrongly persuaded by this argument, that we are distinctive on a scale of 4 billion years. Never before has a single species exerted the sort of power we exert on planetary systems. Groups of species, yes, but then that's because each individual species was slightly different genetically. A single species can only have this sort of impact if something cultural is going on, because this is not a matter of genetic diversity, as you've already said, Emlyn. So something new is happening on the scale of 4 billion years. What is it? And I personally think there's a fairly simple answer, which is that brainy species, and we're really talking mammals, if we're talking large brains, but actually most species learn. Even bacteria can learn. So most species can learn. Brainy species can learn and store a lot of information. But all the evidence suggests that even the most brainy species, with the exception of humans, can accumulate information within limits. And those limits are shown by the fact that they may explore a number of niches. They may even enter new niches, but there's a limit to how many niches they can live in. Now, what we can say about humans is that so far, there is no limit to the niches on Earth that we seem capable of living within. And in fact, we now are changing niches. We're creating niches for ourselves. So if that is true, then the key to manipulating your environment for a species is the information you have. So what we have here is a species in which information about how to manage your environment can accumulate apparently without limit. And that is the first time we've seen such a species. Even, chimps, of course, have culture. They can accumulate information, but we have no evidence that chimps can build up, can increase their control over their environments across many generations. So this is what I've called collective learning. And I think its source is very simple. Its source is a system of communication that has crossed a threshold. Once you cross that threshold, so much information is exchanged between individual members of that species that over time, more and more information can be stored and accumulated. Now, once you have such a species, and I think we're the first to have existed in 4 billion years, then everything changes. Because what you can say about that species is wait several generations and its power will increase, and that increase in power will be shown first by exploring new niches and eventually by creating new niches. Now, for the first 100,000 or 200,000 years of human history, that process of innovation, increasing ecological power, stuttered. It was slow. There were reversals. But in the last 10,000 years, it's accelerated. Exactly why? It may be to do with writing. It may be to do with agriculture. We don't know. But so here we have a species which cannot help increasing its ecological power. Now we've suddenly got to the point where this is becoming problematic. I mean, it's been problematic on local scales in the past, community and land, but now it's problematic on a global scale, and we are rushing to understand how to deal with a level of collective power that has now become dangerous. Sorry for that long riff. But I and they may be crucial to understanding what we need to do. Sorry, Emlyn.
Daniel, could we go to that slide I think you have of the geneticist on the dispersal of Homo sapiens from Africa?
Of course.
So this, I think, is relevant to what David was just saying. I agree with you called it the ecological power, or you used ecological as an adjective. But I would just say, David, that of course ecological means and implies some kind of, a productive interaction between environment and individual. And I think that a lot of human activity is not very ecological. It's very predominant. And it's actually, as we said earlier, detached its mentality from the needs of nature. But I digress. Let me just take you to this diagram. This is a fantastic illustration from the New York Times in 2018. And so you can Google this and it comes up right away. It shows in a nutshell the nature of 40 or 50,000 years of migration of Homo sapiens out of Africa. We were all of Homo sapiens. All of us are out of Africa, and we've been moving and mixing ever since. And so you can see in the yellow area across southern Europe and the Near East, the Middle East, and into Asia. That's the area of Neanderthals, the last congruent species of the genus Homo. And in the details that are in the paragraphs across the map, with pauses in the Middle East and in Southeast Asia, you have a tremendous span of time from less than 1,000 years ago or thereabouts in Australia and New Zealand to tens of thousands of years ago across southern Europe and into Asia. I think what's fascinating, and it's I think a frontier of anthropological research, is that, you know, that small group of Homo sapiens 40 or 50,000 years ago, while there were still some remaining Neanderthal humans, were incredibly brave to migrate out of the landscape they knew. This was still a sort of a glacial climate in the northern hemisphere, but climates were being affected worldwide in the sort of the southern latitudes. And so what I'm saying is that I think it's fascinating and very, very important from a human history, big history perspective, is that that first group of so-called indigenous humans would, within a few 10,000 years, diversify, not only radiate geographically, but in so doing, they would start to be separate into what we now call Western societies, and they would become very much conditioned by their local surrounding environments and would start to eat different things, kill different things, grow different things, and build different things as Homo sapiens move through their Stone Age and Iron Age and Copper Age and into modern Homo sapiens. And so I think that, you know, one of the great missing understandings is that when we say nature and humanity, we know what nature means in terms of the biosphere and the organization of animal and plant species and what we've done to that. And we can get onto that, I think, a bit later. But in terms of humanity, that's a very unuseful generalizing term. Humanity comprises all of the things I just have quickly summarized in terms of the diversification of Homo sapiens as they radiated out of Central Africa to occupy ecologically niche sense of the term almost all the rest of the world. And so I think this diagram reminds us that it's going to be very sobering to come to terms with how each of the parts of humanity have actually originated in ways that I still don't think we have really sort of spent enough time trying to grasp. We do know this research by David Reich from the Harvard Medical School on DNA, and it shows incredible detail of when and with what relationships over time and space that Homo sapiens diversified and migrated and settled and then moved on. But I think there's so many more questions embedded in this kind of data.
Can I respond quickly to that, Emlyn? First, I think there's a very good reason to think that humans have been in Australia for at least 65,000 years. And that, I think, I've at least it's been argued that means these migrations must have been earlier than 50,000 years ago. Anyway, that's one point. Secondly, when I talk about ecological power, I'm trying to use that term in a neutral sense. Let's rephrase it. Our power to manipulate our surroundings, for good or bad, has increased over time. And the third point I'd like to make is that graph, that map you've just shown, I've been using versions of that since the 1990s. And what I find significant in it is that I know of no other species, maybe there are some bird species of which you could say this, but no other species that was capable of such migrations. And it's not the intention, it's the fact that we had the flexibility, our ancestors had the flexibility to move into niches different from those they were familiar with. That seems to me the critical thing. And it was made possible by this constant, slow trickle of new knowledge about environments, not only your home environment, but also neighboring environments. So that this behavior of a species, well, I have to qualify that by saying we're talking about at least 3 species at this stage, Denisovans and Neanderthals as well. But this species has shown a capacity to move into new niches that it didn't originally involve in, that is completely exceptional. That is what I find significant in this graph. It points to something very new about our ancestors.
David, to your point that research shows that archaeological finds may turn back by big chunks of time, the dates on that diagram, the world map I just showed, using the example of Australia. I just saw last week a documentary that in the view of anthropologists, is pretty convincing that whereas it was previously thought that Homo sapiens did not make it down to South America until after there was an ice-free corridor between the Rocky Mountains and the continental ice sheets of North America, that impact has been thrown out as probably false by the discovery of artifactual remains of Homo sapiens 30,000 years ago in South America. So I think that map is indeed subject to massive modification as key archaeological finds come forward, and so I agree, but I'm pointing to the deeper point that what really went on anthropologically between that first experimental migrating group of indigenous people out of Central Africa, and in what way did they diversify? In what way did they come to be so diversified as they dispersed geographically into all of the sort of aspects of humanity that we see in today's world?
Okay, Daniel, sorry, stop me if you want to move on to a new thing. But I'll try to make this point very quickly. I've been recently reading my way into a fascinating body of literature that I wish I'd come across years ago. And it's about, it begins with the work of Alfred Lord, singer of tales in Yugoslavia. And it's about orality and the power of societies that don't have writing, and the fact that rituals, dances, songs, poetry, songlines. I've got a book here called Songlines, which is a sort of wonderful introduction to a fantastic series in Australia about indigenous science. That's the most powerful way I can put it. Astronomy, biology, and so on. This body of research is showing how the systematic, conscious, formal use of mnemonic devices meant that even cultures without writing could store, and worked hard to store, a huge amount of information about their environment. So that we should think of writing as a mnemonic. It's a way of storing information. It's a peculiarly powerful one, and it may have accelerated processes of processes that allowed us to store new information. But even societies before 10,000 years ago almost certainly had a capacity to systematically, consciously store, preserve, and transmit to later generations information about the environment. It's often embedded in language or stories that we moderns find cute. But one of the reasons we find it cute is because the only stories that were ever told to anthropologists were the stories that were made available to the public and therefore to children. So they're the equivalent of children's stories. The serious information in oral cultures was very often available only to initiates, and that excluded the anthropologists. So we should not doubt the technological and scientific capacity of humans 50,000 years ago. And that takes me back to my point about collective learning. I think what is striking about those early communities you talk about, Emlyn, is not that they wanted to enter new environments. I suspect there are chimp communities that would love to go into a new environment because they feel a bit of gentle population pressure. It was that they were able to do this, and they were able to do it because they had the information you needed to experiment with new environments.
Just a quick illustration. When I was very much into IMAX films, I was fascinated by one made by a German film producer on revealing incredible behavior by chimpanzees who we like to think are gentle, loving, and all the time gentle, loving creatures. But this documentary followed the determination by one troop of chimpanzees who, bearing sticks and bent over, looking like commandos, were charging through the forest because they were annoyed that another neighboring group of chimpanzees had invaded their territory.
Yeah.
Back to you, Daniel.
Okay. We have 1 hour of conversation, so I'd like to talk now about the controversy of the year. I believe, at least, was the rejection of the Anthropocene as a geological epoch by the International Commission on Stratigraphy. What's truly at stake? What do you think about that?
Well, it certainly is a major event, and one that I've followed and I'm writing about right now with colleagues from Cambridge and London. So it's a big story. It's a very big, unprecedented development, not only for a term to be, quote, rejected, and I'll come back to what that meant in a minute, but also for the proponents of the term that was rejected in the hierarchy of decision-making processes within a profession of geoscience globally, that they were distressed by the decision to reject what they had proposed. And so this burst into international news on March the 4th and 5th, when the news broke that a group called the Quaternary Subcommission. The Quaternary is the geological term for the Ice Age. Each part of the geological timescale, whether we're talking Cretaceous, Jurassic, has its own working group that constantly monitors changes and developments in terminology, stratigraphic terminology, chronostratigraphic terminology, the layers of sediments and how they tell time. And so in 2002, a Nobel laureate chemist, Paul Crutzen, and then a limnologist, an American limnologist, limnology is the scientific study of lakes, Paul Crutzen and Eugene Sturmer proposed to the International Geosphere Biosphere Program, which was a relatively new body. It's the forerunner of the group called Future Earth today. They saw that the Earth system was showing serious human impacts in terms of particularly the atmosphere and climate change, as we would now say it, the greenhouse effect, as well as environmental damage, which they were concerned about. So they thought that the term Anthropocene was appropriate, and that we were now living in, quote, the Anthropocene. It wouldn't be until 2009 that the stratigraphic authorities that make up a part of the International Union of Geological Sciences, the topmost body of geology in the world, mandated an Anthropocene working group composed of some 20 or 30 scientists, mostly stratigraphers, to investigate this term. It would, if we leap forward to 2015, and I think in a very sort of strange, certainly non-traditional way, the proponents of the Anthropocene Working Group published a paper in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, which was a bulletin founded by Einstein right after the bombing of Japan by atomic bombs in the 1945 period that we've just seen brought onto the screen in the film Oppenheimer. So 2015, we have the society that was concerned about what happened in 1945 and formed a journal called the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist, and decided to form an alarm that would go off each New Year's Day to calibrate how close we were to a nuclear Armageddon. And so right now we're 15 seconds to midnight in the latest update of that atomic clock from a human perspective. But I go back to 2015 because I think the details are important and instructive. You have the then chair of the Anthropocene Working Group writing a paper with several colleagues into the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist, anticipating that the Anthropocene term would become an epoch defined by mid-20th century layers of radionuclides, of radioactive material dropped out of the atmosphere after the series of atomic bomb tests between the 1940s and the early 70s, when some 2,000 tests, all of them above ground at that point, all the time, whenever an explosion happened, a test explosion, and the actual original ones that were dropped on Japan, they all left a sign of their activity in lake deposits, in estuary deposits, in the accumulating layers of stalactites in caves and in coral reefs. An incredible amount of detail is on the surface of the Earth recording that event in the mid-20th century. The Anthropocene Working Group was proposing that that is the right definition of the Anthropocene, that it started in the mid-20th century with atomic bomb testing. Well, no, that's not what the group agreed to in the decision that was made in early March. They said that's not a useful definition, and that we need to actually allow the Anthropocene to instead characterize the entirety of the accumulating and ongoing disruptive impacts of Homo sapiens on climates, on environments, on ecosystems, and just about everything, whether you include plastic waste and pollution. Everything that humans have done to alter the natural state of the planet is encompassed in the successor term, which had already been defined, which now becomes the term called the Anthropocene event. So the Anthropocene event starts before the Ice Age ended 12,000 years or so ago, when humans started to control the other megafauna. They probably caused the extinction of woolly mammoths and other megafauna over time, giant bears and giant sloths and so on. And they would in turn incrementally start to alter the environment of their living quarters so thoroughly that we have the exponential rise in anthropogenic impacts on the planet that we now see. The epoch idea from the mid-20th century didn't do that justice. The Anthropocene event idea that's now becoming the successor idea, already defined, but now is the default definition of the Anthropocene. That, in essence, is what's happened.
Are there dates attached to the Anthropocene event?
No, it's in terms of other events in Earth history that are called events in Earth history. They don't necessarily have a precise beginning, David, but this is a new kind of an event by not having a natural cause. It's caused by a species, in our case, the human species. And so its beginning is coincident with that series of changes that occurred as humanity started to become the predominant species in the biosphere, to the point where we started to alter the surface of the Earth. We started to change the course of rivers. We started to cut down forests. We started to take wild animals and turn them into agricultural livestock. We started to dam rivers. We started to create reservoirs. We started to build communities and cities. We started to build transportation infrastructure. We started to drill for oil. We started to find natural resources. And all of these and many more changes over time, each of them having probably a positive effect in terms of the well-being of humanity, but certainly in terms of their negative impact, clear consequences, all of that, which is a gradational but accelerating change over time, constitutes the Anthropocene event. Of which we're giving, I think, a very understandable but very inordinate focus on climate change. And I think Daniel has a couple of images that we can show in due course that talk about the impact of climate change on well, not only on all of the Earth system. This one pertains. It says humanity has impacted all shells of the Earth system and delivering us into a crucial moment in the continuity of time. And that thumbprint on the left is from a pioneering 2015 exhibition called Welcome to the Anthropocene, The Earth in Our Hands, that was at the Deutsche Museum in Munich in Germany, pioneering in its own way, but not really confronting the negative, detrimental effects that humanity was having on the Earth system. So for me, we can't look at the atmosphere without looking at its impacts on all the other spheres. And I think, Daniel, if you allow me just to go to the slide that shows that one, for example, which is also from the New York Times in 2014, actually in, I think earlier than that, the book Sixth Extinction comes out in 2014. But already, this is 10 years ago now, we'd lost to extinction 13% of the birds, 25% of the mammals, and 41% of the amphibia, who are most susceptible because they lay their young in water. And if the water is polluted, that obviously affects the sustenance of the species and of the genera. So the impact of humans has been immense. And I think if we go to the one on sea level change, lastly, which I'm not sure what number that was, Daniel, I think it was probably the last one. No, number.
That's the last slide.
Okay, I'm sorry. Then I don't have the right one. Okay, it doesn't matter. So the effect on the world map, the one, if you could show that, I think it was slide 7. No? Okay. All right. There's a world map in this series somewhere which shows the vulnerability of the world's coastlines, coastal wetlands, deltas, cities that are built within a few feet or meters of sea level, with the transfer of the world's water from above sea level in ice sheets and in glaciers. And the part of that cryosphere that's of most concern is a huge part of the Antarctica ice sheet, which alone could raise sea level by the end of the 21st century by several feet, which is enough to be catastrophic to vulnerable coastal communities. So it's that effect of climate change, in addition to extreme weather. But it gets very serious when we literally have to move from where we're living to be more inland and to higher ground. And it's not surprising that a book came out last year called Nomad Century about the predictions of how much of humanity is going to have to migrate to higher ground inland in the next century, and centuries, plural.
I was thinking here, if the Anthropocene has become, at least to the International Commission on Stratigraphy, has become an epoch, not an event. An event, not an epoch. And if it comprises the entire history of humanity, wouldn't it pose a threat to the efforts of climate activists, for example? That's a concern because the idea of the Anthropocene, it's very important for climate activists, especially if they can frame the Anthropocene as something that emerges with capitalism or the industrial revolution, or etc. If the Anthropocene is so big, so old as it is suggested, what problems it could create for climate activists?
Well, I appreciate the point you're making, but let me, in fact, just point out that in all of the conventions of the United Nations, called the Conference of the Parties, the last ones being in the Middle East and in the last one just recently in Dubai, that I don't believe the word Anthropocene has hardly ever, if ever, been mentioned in those dialogues. It's a geological term, and it hasn't surfaced as part of the vocabulary and the conversation. It should, and I believe it must, but it hasn't yet, because climate change is considered as being this thing which is that we understand to be the effects of burning of fossil fuels, which it is, but it hasn't dealt, in my view, adequately with the repercussions of altering the altitude and latitude of ecosystems. Climate change has altered the biosphere, It's causing animals to have to move, and in many cases not successfully moving and being rendered extinct. We've also got the problem of rising sea levels, as I just mentioned. And so I think that the Conference of the Parties, the COP meetings, as they're called, which are massive affairs. The one in Dubai was attended, I think, by 90,000 people, and most of the states in the world, the countries in the world, were represented. But are they really talking about the right things to do with climate change? Are they really understanding the repercussions well beyond heating of the atmosphere in terms of effects that are going to cause a lot of humanity to have to migrate up altitude and inland from their coastal communities? Already cities like Kuala Lumpur in Indonesia are actively planning a more inland location for the city because they're getting tired of flooding so much. Miami is also, Fort Lauderdale, New York City. There's loads of coastal cities that are being really vulnerable to sea level rise. And this has to be an impact that needs to be discussed at these global convenings every year called COP, Conference of the Parties. It sounds, they're not really addressing some of the core issues in my view. So point is that climate change proponents do need to know about the Anthropocene, but they also need to know that it's not equal to the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene is the cumulative and ongoing, pervasive, predominant adverse impacts of Homo sapiens that started way before we started to be concerned about climate change.
Can I add? Thank you very much for that account of the politics of the Anthropocene. And I must admit, I like the idea of the Anthropocene event. I think getting hung up on a specific date was a bit of a problem. And I don't see, Daniel, why it should provide a problem for climate activists. If you use the metaphor of a long fuse, that might capture it. I mean, the fuse was lit, well, at least 50,000, I suspect a lot earlier. The megafaunal extinctions in Australia happened about 40,000 years ago. So we know that there were, is it Paul Ruddiman who's been arguing for 20 years that humans had a very significant impact on global climates 2,000 years ago, and you can measure those impacts on what there are records in the Greenland ice of the industrial activities of the Roman Empire. So the idea that the fuse was lit a long time ago, but the explosion has occurred just in the last century or two, I think is the appropriate way of thinking about all of this. If you want to see capitalism as the villain, well, you can see capitalism as an accelerator of old processes, a very powerful accelerator of old processes. So I think the climate activists, well, all of us need to take on board the idea that, as Emlyn says, this is a consequence of our nature as a species. And that's not to blame individuals, but collectively and in unplanned ways, we've had an accelerating impact. Daniel, could you put up the one slide I sent, which is from a recent argument, and it's a naive project. It's trying to argue that there is a sort of graphic shape to human history, and you can measure growing impacts. So this actually measures population, but I'm using population growth as a sort of very rough surrogate for human impacts. And the point of the graph is simply that one way of thinking about human history is as a slow and accelerating increase in what I earlier called human ecological power and impacts. And that acceleration has become exponential in the last century or two, and that's what has generated the discussions about the term the term Anthropocene. And from a big history perspective, I think what is fascinating here is that we know of no species of which you could draw a graph like this, apart from humans. And secondly, it suggests a wonderful research agenda for historians and anthropologists and prehistorians, which is looking for the kinks in this graph, the points where suddenly there was a sort of kick forward. The end of the last ice age and the beginnings of agriculture is almost certainly one of those points. So is the fossil fuels revolution.
David, I think that's a great explanation. And you're reminding me that when Paul Crutzen, the Nobel climate scientist that I mentioned earlier, when he wrote his now very famous one-page paper in the journal Nature called Geology of Mankind, he was very convinced that the Anthropocene, a term which he was proposing already, should start with the Industrial Revolution. But there was a quick pointing out that the Industrial Revolution was firstly not a global event. It was a very Eurocentric event. And secondly, as industrialization grew as a human habit, it was what geologists call diachronous, meaning it was transgressing time, and it wasn't all at the same moment. So really what it was realized is that the term Anthropocene was kind of dead on arrival by that definition of the Industrial Revolution, because the assumption was, well, there's a defined isochronous, meaning everywhere at the same time, lower boundary of what might be recognized in sediments showing signs of the Industrial Revolution. But in fact, it's a line which slopes across time. And so what the epoch required, which was satisfied in the mid-20th century fallout of atomic bomb testing residue, was an isochronous boundary. It was a golden spike, as geologists like to say. But in fact, the Industrial Revolution, which had been proposed, was, to use your answer just now, was just one of those many kinks. It was a particularly pronounced kink, but it would be succeeded by other bigger kinks, and it was preceded by other lesser kinks. And I think that's the understanding that hopefully world leaders and attendees at the annual climate conferences start to grasp, is that this has been a cumulative and intensifying and ongoing calamity, really, for the natural state of the planet, in which humans have become a predominant species that don't, in large measure, understand the impact they've had.
Okay, all right, thank you. I think we have time for one more discussion, maybe, because our seminar has 1 hour and 23 minutes. Oh, I would like to ask you this. I've been wondering if can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. I've been wondering. The Anthropocene has produced a lot of different objects of analysis in big history, but and in environmental history, etc., etc. But we have many things that can be analyzed and discussed and studied under the Anthropocene umbrella. But I think that the most important impact of the idea of the Anthropocene on history and on big history lies in the idea that we have to think about historical agency. Because if humans are a geological force, and that's the whole idea of the Anthropocene as a concept, humans are no different from a volcano, for example, or no different from, I don't know, from tectonic plates, etc., etc. If they are not different, so this 19th century idea that you have humans versus the nature, or humans versus animals, or humans as some kind of, I don't know, angelic and special and God created being. This 19th century idea goes down the drain because we're not a species with geological agency, because we are pretty much the same as all these other agents, historical agents, humans and non-humans, that share the universe with us. So I'd like to ask you that, don't you think that there is a major impact on epistemology and ontology coming from the Anthropocene, especially in the history?
Well, that's not you didn't end with an
Sorry,
easy question, did you, Daniel?
Go.
Sorry,
David, you go first, please.
Sorry, I missed the final question.
No, the question is the main contribution, or the main changes the Anthropocene can create in epistemological and ontological terms are not related to the very idea of historical agency, because we are the volcanoes and plate tectonics and non-human species are so historical agents as we are. So we're not that different from them. That's the idea.
Look, the idea of agency, it's a human agency. It's a very fashionable term at the moment amongst historians, and of course it's important, but it has to be used with nuance, because agency, humans act consciously. Some of their actions can make a conscious difference, but a hell of a lot of their actions have consequences that we're not aware of. So insofar as our actions have consequences we're not aware of, yes, perhaps the analogy with a volcano makes sense. But insofar as we do actually have some modest degree of agency, then it makes sense to think that there are different possible futures which will depend on the actions that humans take in the next 30 or 40 years. I mean, what we do in the next few decades, I believe, will have impacts on the biosphere for many millennia, perhaps for millions of years. And can I, Daniel, do you mind if I riff briefly on the future? Because I've written a book on the future. And the other aspect of the Anthropocene is what kind of future scenarios it may suggest. Now, if I'm right that it is in the nature of our species, not because we're radically different from chimps, but because of one rather small but spectacularly significant difference, an increase in our capacity to share knowledge that takes us across a threshold and allows knowledge to increase across generations. If that is intrinsic to our species, then certain things follow, which is that on a long trend, not always on a short trend, but on a long trend, we expect human ecological power, technological power, whatever you want to call it, to increase. Now, one of the consequences of that is that just as on that map that Emlyn put up, humans left the environment in which they evolved and spread around the Earth. Eventually, I think the logic of that suggests that we will spread to other planets. And one way of thinking about that is that planet Earth has become conscious in the limited sense that decisions that will have a huge impact on the Earth will be taken partly as a result of conscious thought. Now, if we spread to other planets, then, like it or not, whether this is a good thing or not, it's very likely that humans will start taking control of other planets, and in a few thousand years, maybe of other planets in other star systems, planets and moons in other star systems, which means that the space operas of science fiction maybe need to be taken more seriously than historians have in the past. Now, if that future is at all realistic, what it means is that we are living at an absolutely spectacular time, not for good or bad. And again, I'm trying to say this without putting a moral loading on it. A point at which things are happening on this planet that may, when looked back on in several thousand years' time, look significant, not just on the scales of planet Earth, but on galactic scales. Now, I say that as a big historian because I think big history should encourage us to ask questions like, can we imagine what the Anthropocene might mean to people looking back, or people doing big history in several thousand years' time? I think those sort of questions need to be asked. And that assumes, of course, that we'll get through the bottleneck that you referred to earlier, Daniel. For what it's worth, I'm fairly optimistic about that, but of course we just don't know. So sorry for that riff, but I wanted to say that because I think that is the sort of question that the Anthropocene raises for those of us who are intrigued by the big perspective of big history.
Fascinating perspective, David. What I just choose to add to this very provocative and evocative question is, I'm thinking that next week, you spoke about thousands of years into the future. Next week, a total eclipse of the sun crosses the United States and maritime Canada. And we know that eclipses, lunar or solar eclipses, partial or total, freaked early humans out because there was no way to understand what was happening. In the same way, I think anthropological research, as I understand it, has also sort of shown that when early humans, early Homo sapiens, maybe early Neanderthals, when somebody died or when somebody was born, there was no way of understanding what actually was happening. Where did this child come from? Where does this now dead, lifeless body go? What is the meaning of these events in terms of 7 generations and good ancestry and so on? And so I think what this leads me to is that we need to ask, going back to the earlier diversion into the questions confronting anthropology, we need to sort of understand exactly, what some of those early key moments were, when in the Mediterranean, when there was a major volcanic eruption that caused whole civilizations to migrate and escape. They didn't understand it. They feared that they were getting God's retribution. This was a later stage in human consciousness. Same with volcanic eruptions and earthquakes and so on. Now we understand, at least a lot of humanity understands, the why and the when and the what of earthquakes and volcanoes. But in the first generations of humanity, so to speak, they freaked people out and they couldn't deal with it. And so I think, that when we talk about the rapid explosion of human sentience and of inventiveness and of modification of the Earth's surface, I think we've got to understand that those changes had very important to understand roots in the early mentality evolution, the attitudinal evolution, the behavioral evolution of the earliest humans as they migrated and occupied new territory and started to colonize and dominate their surrounding environments. It's everything has been just steps in that same journey, I think, ever since.
Agreed.
Oh, yeah, I've just asked about the agency because I'm not that confident about free will. That's the problem. Because if you associate agency with free will, and if you consider that free will might be an illusion, you're not that different from ants, for example. That's that's strange because big history took me to that, to question that we might be not that different from Of course, we are different. Yes, every species is different, but you know.
Well, it was Edward E.O. Wilson, the famous biologist, who coined the controversial term social behavior and social biology, using, of all things, ants to demonstrate, the ability of living organisms to organize for greater effects than any one individual could do by themselves. So maybe this is a long way from the beginning of the Anthropocene, but maybe we could draw this to a close looking at the tiniest of organisms, that of ants, and what E.O. Wilson told us about the social behavior of ants.
And the fact that the collective may behave in ways that individuals didn't intend.
Yeah.
Indeed, absolutely, totally.
Okay. So I have a last question, and that's the last one. Yeah, I will do that. Do you think there's a good Anthropocene and a bad one? What do you think?
David, you go.
There's something.
Well, I argued exactly that, because you referred briefly and in passing to the huge changes that the good impact on humans, on many humans of the Anthropocene, the impact on human health, on human well-being, on human nutrition, on levels of cultural safety has been absolutely massive. So particularly if you are a middle-class citizen of the world today, you are a beneficiary of many aspects of the Anthropocene. And taking a more positive view, I think what the Sustainable Development Goals, for example, were trying to do was saying, can we find ways of preserving the good Anthropocene, while minimizing the consequences of our colossal power? That, I think, is the huge challenge. It may be an impossible challenge, but I think it's a challenge that we probably need to take on, because the alternative is to say, sorry, future generations, your life is going to be grossly impoverished, and I'm going to carry on living this way for the rest of my life.
The term good or bad, in my last word for this fantastic conversation, Daniel and David, is that in one of the first issues of the journal, the scholarly journal Anthropocene, about 10 years ago, I think now, a Canadian author had in his title of his paper, he basically said, will there be a good, a bad, or an ugly, a good, a bad, or an ugly Anthropocene? And I think what he was meaning was that, let's start on the positive. It'll be good if we learn and react responsibly to the impacts we've had. It will be ugly if we never bother to ask the questions we should ask ourselves and fall inadvertently into a terrible future. It'll be bad if we kind of do figure it out, but still don't do what we should do. And I think the jury is out. Greta Thunberg, for example, the Swedish activist who started off being an activist when she was a youth, a teenager, and she's now, I think, a young adult. She, for one, is pessimistic that we're not going to learn, and the leaders in the room are not capable of acting and reacting and thinking responsibly.
That's it. So that's it. That's the end of our webinar. I'd like to thank you very much. Thank you, David. Thank you, Emlyn. I hope you can join again to keep this conversation going. And thank you very much for you on the audience. And if you have any comments, you can send to us, and we can answer your comments. Thank you very much. Have a nice.
Thanks to the IBHA. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Daniel and Emlyn.